On the night of August 14, 1969, most of the citizens of Cedar Hill, Ohio were of the firm opinion that the whole sad-ass world was going straight to hell on greased rails. Now, it didn't matter if you listened to Walter Cronkite, the Huntley Brinkley Report, Eric Severide, or even, God bless him, Billy Graham. All the news was lousy. Kissinger and Thieu were in the middle of Vietnam peace negotiations that were laying goose eggs left and right. Members of some psycho cult led by a guy named Manson had butchered Sharon Tate and 3 other people in Los Angeles and then turned around the next night and killed Leo and Rosemary LaBianca. The Soviet Union and China were getting into some serious border clashes that everyone just knew was going to end up with bright nuclear mushroom clouds lighting up the commie skies. British troops had been deployed in Northern Ireland to deal with the violence between Protestants and Catholics after Jack Lynch eloquently pleaded with the UN to get involved. And if this weren't enough, as if a decent church-going, hard-working, law-abiding, tax-paying, middle-class, just keeping your head above water Americans still didn't have enough to worry about, still didn't have enough to make them shake their heads in despair, some farmer named Max Yasner in Bethel, New York, who should have known better, had just agreed to allow a rock festival to take place on his land, and Woodstock, as the kids were calling it, had parents and police losing sleep over how it was all going to turn out. No sirree, no damn doubt about it. Everything was on the verge of being flushed right down the crapper. And knowing all of this, Charlie Smeds, decorated veteran of World War II, now night watchman at the Franklin Beaumont Casket Factory in Old Town East, was still the happiest man in the world. Because in 3 days, his son Robert was coming home from Vietnam. Yeah, okay, right. The boy was now missing his left leg. Both Charlie and his wife Ethel had wept more than a few tears after getting that news, but Bobby was, by God, alive. He'd made it out. And after that bloody business at the Battle of Who, his son's survival qualified in Charlie's eyes as an indisputable miracle. 3 understrength Marine battalions, less than 2,500 men, had fought over 10,000 soldiers with the People's Army of Vietnam and the Viet Cong, who still fired up from the Tet Offensive less than a month before, attacked the air base at Phu Bai, where Bobby was stationed. Bobby was injured late in the second week of the battle when a PAVN B-40 rocket was fired at the fuel depot less than 50 yards from the storage shed he and a dozen of his fellow Marines were using for temporary cover. Bobby had taken some metal in the shoulder and lost partial and temporary, thank God for all of his blessings, use of his right arm, but that didn't stop Bobby or the other men from fighting their way out. The longest and bloodiest battle of the war so far, and Bobby survived with minor injuries. I feel like me and the rest of the guys are invincible after getting through that, he'd written to Charlie and Ethel in his last letter 14 months ago. Then he added, knock wood. And after all of that, after surviving one of the most terrible battles of the war, if not the most terrible battle period, he lost his leg on a routine patrol because he'd stopped to pet a damn dog, and in the process, he'd stepped on a landmine. The dog, of course, emerged uninjured. Charlie imagined that Bobby was going to make a lot of tasteless jokes about that, being a cat lover like his mom, and if he didn't make the jokes, then Charlie would feel obligated to him. Bobby would expect nothing less from his old man. So, on this August night, 3 weeks into the worst drought Central Ohio had experienced in nearly 40 years, the temperature finally bottoming out at 87 degrees as Charlie arrived at work at 9 p.m. The rest of the world might be going down the tubes, but Charlie Smed's world was as bright and cheerful as a child's favorite storybook. Say, to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, or The Wind in the Willows, or The Story of Ferdinand, which had always been one of Bobby's favorites. A happier man you couldn't find. Skip ahead here until Charlie goes on his break. He steps outside behind the casket factory, which is adjacent to a nightclub called Tally's Hideaway. At 1:30 a.m., Charlie let himself out the door facing Cedar Crest Avenue and took his usual place on the bench. The night was still unbearably hot and dry, but he didn't mind in the least. He had a nice view of the street, of the darkened clubs and shops and the galleries, and best of all, the glittering night sky. The stars were out in full force tonight, and as Charlie dug into his enormous meatloaf sandwich on rye, nobody made meatloaf like his Ethel. just one of the 1,000 reasons he was the luckiest man in the world that she permitted him to be her husband. He watched the stars and remembered all those times that Bobby as a child had talked about being a spaceman, this being a dream from watching those old science fiction movies that Channel 10 always showed on Saturday afternoons. Charlie wondered if Bobby and the rest of his buddies over in Vietnam had been able to watch that month when Apollo 11 had landed on the moon and Neil Armstrong had done the impossible, set foot on a place somewhere other than Earth. Yes, sir, things weren't nearly as awful as most folks thought. Not as the human race could actually put a man on the moon. Miracles, Meatloaf, and Starlight were Charlie's companions on the bench that night. A good woman was waiting for him back home, and his son would soon again be sleeping under the roof of the home where he was born. A man would be a fool to ask for much more. At the top of the stairs leading into Tally's hideaway, the door opened, and out onto the landing stepped Eugene Talley, son of William Bill to my friends and customers, Isaac Talley, who had opened the doors to his club way back in the 1920s. Eugene had his father's onyx complexion, massive shoulders and childlike grin, as well as a booming, rich baritone voice that always reminded Charlie of the late Dr. Martin Luther King, God rest his gallant and battered soul. "Fine evening, isn't it?" said Eugene. "Well, it was until you decided to come out here and ruin quiet. Oh, as opposed to the way you ruined my perfectly good view of an empty bench. The high point of my day, I'll have you know, is coming out here after closing down and looking at that bench. It is a splendid bench, as benches go. The Mona Lisa of benches, one might even say. And what do I get? I get to look at you sitting there instead. Oh, by the way, I think I saw a pigeon take a crap on that earlier. About the place where you're sitting, as a matter of fact. Nice to see you, Eugene. I'm sorry I couldn't get out here sooner. Couldn't get the receipts to balance out. Now, do my eyes deceive me, or is that one of Ethel's amazing meatloaf sandwiches you're eating? No, it's half a meatloaf sandwich. You know damn well the other half's still wrapped up in there with your name on it. That is, if you don't mind sitting in pigeon crap with me." Eugene spread his arms in front of him. Now, how am I supposed to turn down such a charming invitation? As he made his way down the stairway, Eugene had arthritis in one knee, and so he had to take the stairs a bit slower than most folks. He said, "Any word about your boy yet?" Charlie beamed. "I was wondering how long it was going to take you to ask. Ethel and me got the word out this morning. Bobby's coming home in 3 days. Now Eugene's smile became wide and radiant. "Oh, Charlie, isn't that just fine? That is by far the best news I've heard in a while. Damn fine news, my friend, damn fine." He reached out and shook Charlie's hand as he reached the bench. "Please tell Ethel that I am so happy for the three of you." "I sure will," said Charlie, handing Eugene the other half of the sandwich, which Ethel had purposely made twice as big as Charlie could have possibly eaten on his own, knowing how he liked to share with Eugene during his break. "I'll tell you what," said Eugene, unwrapping his half of the sandwich and giving it a good, deep, appreciative smell. "When Bobby gets himself settled, you bring him and Ethel down here one weekend, and I'll make sure you get the best table in the house. Their dinners and drinks are on me." Charlie blinked. What about my dinner and drinks?" "Did you make this meatloaf sandwich?" "I did not." "Did you just spend a couple of years in Southeast Asia and get yourself wounded twice?" "Well, I couldn't very well be sitting here with you if I did, now could I?" "Then you pay. I am a generous soul, not a rube to be taken advantage of." "Why do I put up with you?" "Because, Charlie, you and I are the only people in this town who can appreciate the aesthetic value of benches. Damn, the sandwich sure is something. Tell Ethel she really outdid herself this time. Oh, you know how she lives for your praise. Hell, buddy, if it weren't for you and Ethel, most nights I'd have to settle for fried eggs and..." "What's that?" Charlie sat up a little straighter. "You mean that noise?" The two men sat in silence for a moment, listening as the sound grew closer. "You know, if I didn't know better," whispered Eugene, "I swear that was the sound of a..." "Oh, holy shit," said Charlie, pointing toward the corner of Cedar Crest in East Main. "Tell me that ain't what I think it is." Eugene, as stunned as Charlie, could only shake his head. Charlie made the sign of the cross. A few moments later, as both men realized they weren't imagining things, Eugene did the same. This is an excerpt from a guide called The Visitor's Guide to Cedar Hill, pages 59 and 60. has voted to make the plot of the grounds and graves in the old graveyard at the eastern section, taking care to protect and preserve the tombstones as they and those whose final resting place they mark are transported to a less neglected site, wrote the mayor in his 1902 proclamation. And so the bodies which have lain undisturbed for nearly 100 years were the first to be exhumed and transported to the expanded grounds of Cedar Hill Cemetery, now the county's oldest and most famous burial site. With tongue firmly in cheek, one citizen at the time of the old graveyard exhumations wrote a snippet of verse that remains popular to this day. The first cemetery was Beckwith's backyard, where formerly Murphy sold his eggs, his bread, and his lard. The next was the corner of Cedar Crest in East Main, where now the museum stands amid sunshine and rain. Later they moved it to Cedar Hill North, so old Adam dug up his wives and set forth. And through Cedar Hill streets, both wide and narrow, trundled their bones in an ancient wheelbarrow. One of the mysteries that has persisted concerning the remains of the old graveyard is the mound of lone stone by Cedar Crest Avenue. All sorts of tales have been passed around about it, the most popular being that a man and his horse are entombed there as symbols of those who were once buried in the area. It is perhaps from the early Welsh settlers that this legend originated. Why the stone was not removed is not known, nor does anyone know why the mound still stands. It is probable there are still bodies buried in the area, under the sidewalks and alleyways, because the 1902 proclamation did not stipulate the removal of all corpses buried there, due to the fact that so many settlers perished during the Great Cholera epidemic of 1805 that locating and removing all bodies would be nearly impossible. Many of those bodies are now most probably buried beneath the foundations of homes and businesses, with a particular high concentration in the Old Town East area. But with the continual expansion of the Cedar Hill population, it is expected that the city's government will be seeking yet more land over the next few decades, and perhaps some of the still buried, forgotten dead can at last be exhumed and moved to a proper place of final rest. Charlie Smets and Eugene Talley watched, dumbstruck, as an ancient, rickety, horse-drawn wooden wagon made its way down the street, the driver's face hidden by a thick kerchief covering his nose and mouth. The wagon was filled with dead bodies and unearthed tombstones from the cholera epidemic. Some of the bodies were so badly decomposed that bits and pieces of flesh loosened by the exhumation, as well as the rattling of the wagon's wheels, fell off and were carried away by a non-existent breeze, vanishing into dust before they reached as high as the lowest streetlight. Now, many of the bodies, the freshest ones, were still bloated, some slightly, some severely, but all were discolored. A few were desiccated, and some were more bone than flesh. The clop, clop, clop of the horse's hooves echoed much more loudly than it should have, not because it was a still, dry evening, but because as Charlie and Eugene watched, the shadow cast by the horse and wagon turned to asphalt around and beneath it. As Charlie and Eugene watched, the shadow cast by the horse and wagon turned the asphalt street around and beneath it into cobblestone. Charlie began to say, "What the holy hell?" But the rest died in his throat when another wagon, this one much older than the first, came into view just as the other was swallowed in the shadow. This new wagon also carried bodies, but these corpses, despite the sickening color of their skin, looked fresh, as if death had claimed them only mere minutes ago. There were two people in the front of this wagon. Both had their noses and mouths covered with heavy winter scarves, and both wore thick gloves as well as heavy overcoats. The sound of the horse's hooves hitting the cobblestone was muffled because of the snow blanketing the areas of the street where the wagon's shadow fell. Behind this wagon, leaving footprints in the snow cast by their own shadows, marched a procession of people of varying ages. The elderly being assisted by the younger and stronger, the middle-aged who walked arm in arm or sometimes alone, and at last, several children, all dressed in winter clothing over 100 years out of date, all of them trying to look brave as they fought back the tears that sometimes won out, and then froze to their faces before getting halfway down their cheeks. At the end of this procession walked one little girl, far too thin and far too pale, completely alone, hugging a tattered handmade doll to her chest. The frozen tears on her face did not stop her from crying even harder. Her eyes were the saddest thing that either Eugene or Charlie had ever seen. As the wagon and procession moved farther down the street and into the darkness, the little girl stopped, staring down at her feet and wiping her nose on the sleeve of her coat, which Charlie realized was far too light for the winter weather she was experiencing. She exhaled, her breath misting into the air, squeezed her doll tighter, wiped her nose once more, and then simply stood there, staring at Charlie and Eugene. "You know, my daddy told me about this when I was a kid," said Eugene, gripping Charlie's arm, his voice a whisper, as if he were afraid that if he spoke too loudly, the spell would